Welcome back to Speducation. I am your host, Brandon Reed, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. For those of you who have already been here or been watching my videos, as you can tell, I got a haircut, I shaved, and the reason why is because we are starting fresh this week. For the past 6 weeks, we've been looking at parts of an IEP, and it's been a long, arduous journey, but for the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some individual topics. And today, we're going to look at our first. So without further ado, let's jump into today's lesson. Today's lesson, what qualifies someone for special education services? So that is a good question. So what does qualify somebody? Well, here is what qualifies somebody. If the student's disability adversely affects the student's ability to learn. That's as simply as I can put it. Now, you may be wondering, but what does adversely mean? Well, that's simple. Adversely means that the student's disability severely impacts their learning. Basically, what it means is that without accommodations or modifications, the student's not going to be successful. Now, the general ed teacher can provide some of those interventions in the classroom, maybe even some differentiated instruction. But in the end, the student's really not going to be able to be completely successful without additional support through an IEP. So that's what it means when they say adversely. It means that they need additional support that is not necessarily going to be provided by the general ed teacher. That requires additional support provided by special ed staff. So this means that any student with ADHD would qualify, correct? No. And the reason why is because the estimated number of children aged 3 to 17 years old ever diagnosed with ADHD, according to a national survey of parents, is 6 million, which is 9.8%. And that's using data from 2016 and 2019. And all that information comes from the CDC. Now, from another website, edweek.org, many of the children in the sample had a rocky school experience. Their parents reported. About 51% reported problems overall with school, and 30% reported problems with peer relationships. Now, 6 million students, that's not exactly, half of the children across the United States, but it is a big number. And if we were to look at those 6 million and say, yep, they all need special ed services, then that's a lot of kids in special education. So that's why we have to pick and choose, okay? And it's not like, okay, these students, they get it, these students, they don't, okay? Basically, what we do is we look at the severity of the ADHD. Okay, if the ADHD is severe enough that it requires medication and requires extra supports, then clearly the student is going to need help. But if the ADHD is mild enough that it can be managed through interventions in the classroom, then the student may not need a special needs IEP. But again, that depends on the individual. Now, one other thing. If the student has ADHD, then that is a medical diagnosis. There is no label for ADHD in special education because it is a medical diagnosis. The closest thing that comes to it is OHI, which stands for other health impairment. So if a student does qualify for special ed services because the ADHD is severe enough that they require additional support, then they would be put under the label of OHI, other health impairment. So, students with autism must always qualify, right? Actually, no. Autism can be diagnosed through medical determination, okay? Just like ADHD, autism is a medical condition. However, it has to be diagnosed through educational testing in order for it to be considered a learning disability, and it has to adversely affect the student's learning. There's that key word again, adversely. So if a student has a medical diagnosis of autism, that doesn't necessarily qualify them for special ed services. And the reason why is because it has to be through diagnostic educational testing. And they have to prove that the autism severely or adversely affects the student's learning. There are many students that have autism that are so high functioning that you'd never know that they had it, and that their grades are great, but maybe they need more social emotional help that the general ed teacher and general ed staff just aren't qualified to provide. And that is where special ed services come in. But again, this is everything that I'm saying depends on what the case conference committee determines and what the data suggests. So any disability that requires additional services that cannot be met by the general education teacher would most likely qualify for special education services. But again, that depends on what the data from the test says. So that's why all of these students that get tested for special ed services, it's so extensive, because we want to make sure that there is data to support it. Now, even if your child does not qualify for special education services, they may qualify for a 504, which is similar to an IEP, but not as thorough. The main takeaway, though, is this. If the answer to this question, does the student's disability adversely affect their ability to learn, is yes, then they qualify for special education services. So keep that in mind the next time that you may think, well, my kid, I think he has a disability and he may need special ed services. Well, they have to determine that. Now, next week, we will talk about, can a school deny your request for your child to be tested for special education? Well, I'm going to leave this on a cliffhanger and we'll talk about that next week. However, if you liked what you saw, please click the like button. And if you want updates on future videos, feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to post those in the comments, and make sure to share this channel with others, because the more that we share, the more information can get out to those parents that need it. And until next time, class dismissed.